Good afternoon, friends, colleagues. We are beginning the joint project of the International Institute for International Relations, Economic and International, together with Interfax News Agency. As you know, our project is called Russia and the World, a professional conversation. We're trying to acquaint the professional community and people who are simply interested in these issues with the most relevant, most topical issues across the world, and that to a certain extent, and this or that way, have an impact on Russia. So this professional conversation, I think, is truly professional today. First, I would like to express my gratitude to Deputy Chairman of the Russian government, Mr. Novak, who has found the time to participate in our today's discussion. As you know, for him, this year has been a very difficult because there were plummeting demand and spring, but still Mr. Novak is here. We also have Mr. Rai Kwon-chung with us, who has won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. He is also a member of the Global Energy Prize International Awards Committee. He's one of the first ones who raised the issue of energy transition and who has started to talk about irreversible climate changes. Mr. Chung, welcome. We also have with us corresponding member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Madam Telegina. She worked on the government. She was Deputy Minister of Fuel and Energy, as it was called back then. Today, she is the Dean of the Department of International Energy Business at the Gubkin Russian State Oil and Gas University. She is a prominent specialist in this area. We also have with us Alexei Gromov, Principal Director on Energy Studies at the Institute for Energy and Finance. I welcome you all sincerely. Moderating our session today is going to be Global Energy Association President, as well as Deputy Director of the All Russia State TV and Radio Broadcasting Company, Mr. Brilov. The floor is yours, Mr. Brilov. Thank you very much. Mr. Dinkin, I used to be a Deputy Director of Russia Channel, but you said that I'm Deputy Director of the All Russian State TV and Radio Broadcasting Company. It makes me feel even more important. But today I'm here as President of the Global Energy Association. A week ago, we published the report, which is entitled 10 Program Ideas for the Next Decade. It had a huge success across the media. There were 700 quotes, especially at Interfax. And I thank Interfax not just because it provides the platform for our today's discussion, but because Interfax is doing a great job, for which I'm very grateful to colleagues. I'm going to get back to this report on many occasions. That is co-authored by another Nobel Prize winner. But let's right now remember that we've got Mr. Novak with us. Yes, from the energy point of view, this year has been a very difficult one. And besides, he is a pioneer in terms of COVID. Luckily, Mr. Novak has recovered. Right now, I would like to give the floor to you, Mr. Novak. What do you think about this year that is about to end, and what do you think the prospects are for next year? Mr. Novak, we cannot hear you. Switch on your mic, please. The sound has disappeared. And what about now? Yes, thank you. I would like to welcome everyone. A huge thank you for inviting me to talk about topical issues related to the recent developments in the energy field, especially this year, 2020. We've got very topical issues on our agenda, and I would like to dwell a little bit on the situation, about what Russia thinks about the recent developments in the energy markets, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. But just to hook you up, as it were, on Saturday, I was in Saudi Arabia. I went to Riyadh. I met the Minister of Oil, Prince Abdulaziz. We agreed on this visit back in December. When OPEC Plus decision was made, we agreed to meet to talk about the bilateral relations as well as the recent developments of the market. So it was on Saturday and it's Monday. And I think over these 2 days, the situation has changed even more, and it changed quite drastically, and there are constant shifts. As you know, there are strict lockdowns that have been introduced, an additional lockdown on trips to the UK because there's a new strain of COVID-19, allegedly, and we see the adjustment of oil prices, and 2 days ago it was not the case. So the situation that we have run against at the beginning of this year and the current conditions, well, these are different things. And this situation could not have been anticipated, and it was unprecedented in its scale. No one could have predicted precisely the implications for the world economy due to the pandemic, especially the implications and the consequences, and the second quarter this year. And it turns out that the forecasts of economic recovery that were made back in Q2 have not realized. When the forecast that we made when we signed the oil deal, back then we thought that oil demand drop by 20-25 million barrels per day could have led to a glut in the market. And it could have simply led to a complete stop of oil production because there could be a glut and no one would be buying the oil and there would be nowhere to store it. And the storage capacities are limited. And we saw certain markets like the US, when due to the glut, the prices shifted into the negative, which was something unprecedented. And as far as forecasts go, we thought that by the end of this year, the recovery would be stronger than the one we are witnessing right now. We can see that the demand has recovered by 15-17 million barrels per day. But as compared to what we saw before the pandemic, the overall demand drop still stands at around 6-7 million barrels per day, which is a huge amount. No one could have forecast the second wave either in May or in June when the oil prices dropped. But right now, the second wave is all across the world, even though it's still milder than what we saw in spring. And yet the demand is constrained due to lower mobility of our population. If we look at the graphs of how demand is recovering, you'll see that even in July, in August, the demand was higher in certain categories than the one right now. The car fuel, for instance, motor fuel demand level was far superior to the one right now by 40% or so as compared to December. Yes, the demand is recovering gradually, but it is absolutely obvious that another factor that impacts the demand recovery is the irreversible changes in the lifestyle of our planet's population. These changes are taking place in different areas and energy too. Right now, we're holding our conversation online. Even though in the past, before the pandemic, we would have probably met in person, we would have taken a car and got together. But as this year has demonstrated to us, maybe we don't need to do that because we can save time, we can save money, we can save motor fuel, and also aircraft fuel. So our forecasts are shifting right now, and now we think the recovery is going to be slower than we thought initially. Some experts believe that it is going to take up to 2 to 3 years to recover. the demand, but we will monitor the situation and will respond accordingly. You are probably aware of the parameters of the decisions that OPEC countries and OPEC plus countries have taken. We believe that we should increase production as demand recovers, because the the production adjustments are unprecedented. So years ago, we cut the oil production by around 1 million. And this year we had to cut 10 million barrels per day. So right now we've got to recover the production gradually and very cautiously. And starting from January, when we start to meet regularly as agreed upon in December, we will target the market. We will monitor it very closely, and we're going to raise the production very cautiously, step by step. Exporting countries need that because it is a huge contribution to their GDP, to their exports, to their trade, to their economic recovery and growth. And it is important to our country too. Let me say a couple of words about oil and gas, and also energy generation. Now, if we look at gas, natural gas, you can see that it has not been hit as hard as the oil market, even though we have seen significant fluctuations of the gas prices. And we even saw record lows of gas prices, as well as a swift recovery of gas prices by the end of the year. As we can see at the spot markets, the price has risen to 210 for 1,000 cubic meters. And when the crisis struck, we could not have anticipated that the recovery would be so swift. And during the year, we saw that the underground gas storages were full. They were full, almost at a high, at least, rate. But right now the gas is very actively used, and we see that the reservoirs are being depleted, and that's why the prices are recovering. And we believe that next year the market is going to recover by 3%, whereas this year the decrease stood at 3%. So the market is going to recover next year, and it's going to be faster than in the oil market. And we saw that LNG became less competitive because it was more costly than pipeline gas, and pipeline gas is recovering more swiftly because it's more competitive, as we can see. A couple of words about energy generation right now. Evidently, this year we are witnessing a decrease in demand. Across the world, it's going to decrease by 2%, according to our estimates in certain regions and in European countries. The decrease might amount to 6% in France, Spain, the UK. Russia is probably going to see a 2.7% decrease in energy generation demand throughout the year, which is a better result than what we forecast back in April, when we saw a significant drop in demand. The drop was deeper, and we thought that the demand could probably decrease by 4 or 6%. So a 2.7% is a very good figure. It's a very good outcome for us. We believe that energy demand, electricity demand, is going to grow at a faster rate because increasingly more electricity is required to sustain new consumption methods like chargers for electric cars, data processing centers that store big data. Electricity is going to be needed for cloud technology, for digitalization. So electricity consumption is going to grow at a faster rate, and the share of electricity produced through renewables is going to increase in the energy mix as a general trend. I would also like to point out that despite this trend towards a greater share of renewables, it is evident that the share of hydrocarbons is still going to be great in the energy mix, probably not as big as we previously thought. Probably the share is going to be a little smaller. Right now, the share of hydrocarbons is 85%, and the coming 2 decades is going to decrease by 15 percentage points in the overall energy mix, and the share of renewables is going to increase significantly. In other words, the world is still going to be dependent on hydrocarbons, but the climate agenda is going to move increasingly to the forefront. This is something we will have to talk about today. Of course, I refer first and foremost to the Paris Agreement that Russia joined in 2015, supporting the world community's efforts to decrease greenhouse gases emissions and to ensure a transition towards a low carbon future. As of now, this is probably one of the most widely discussed issues, this energy transition. And this energy transition is mostly shared by European countries, some countries in the Asia Pacific, the US in particular too, Canada. As for the European Commission, the European Commission is probably one of the leaders in this process. They are discussing different ways to achieve carbon neutrality. We know that they're working on a draft law that would introduce the carbon tax. It is also a specific issue that needs discussion. I, for one, would like to say that Russia is strongly committed to the climate agenda. And as far as our national contribution is concerned, under the UNFCCC by 2020, Russia has to decrease its emissions by 70% with the 1990 baseline. But of course, factoring in the absorbing capacity of our forests. I would like to highlight that our energy companies are very active, just as their foreign competitors are, and they're coming up with objectives to decrease CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. Just to cite an example, Gazprom has come up with a target of decreasing the emissions by almost 4% by 2024. When gas transport is concerned, Gazprom Neft would like to achieve the use of no less than 95% of its associated petroleum gas. And Rosneft is going to invest around 300 billion rubles into green investment. Tatneft by 2050 wants to become carbon neutral. Lukoil intends to decrease pollutants emissions next year by 5%. Novatek by 2030 plans to decrease its emissions of methane and greenhouse gases by 4% and 5% respectively. This is just one avenue we are pursuing. Apart from that, we would like to continue building and developing renewables. As you know, we've got a 1-year program for building renewable energy sources. and some of the projects have already been implemented right now. We would like to extend this program by another decade until 2035. We are thinking about concrete parameters that can be introduced into this program, but it is evident that the program is going to be adopted, and we are going to continue to stimulate and to develop solar and wind generation in our country. I would like to say that the Russian energy mix is quite efficient and also eco-friendly. The thing is, 19% of our energy mix is accounted for by the nuclear energy, 18% is hydropower, and renewables make up for almost 1%, and its share is going to increase to 4%. So we've got 38% of our energy mix accounted for by renewables and clean sources of energy. As far as the future structure of our energy mix is concerned, another 50% of our energy mix is going to be accounted for by natural gas, and only 14% is accounted for by coal. So in that sense, we are quite efficient. And the carbon footprint and energy generation in Russia is smaller than in other countries such as the US, European countries, China, Australia, India, Japan, and other countries. I would also like to say that our energy policy prioritizes the development of hydrogen economy and hydrogen energy. We've got the necessary groundwork and expertise and competencies too. We've got companies that are working on commercial use technologies for the production of hydrogen, for its storage, transportation, technologies to process CO2, and also technologies that are going to allow us to use hydrogen in transport and in energy. We believe hydrogen is a promising type of energy, and its use is going to be ever wider across the world. It is going to play a crucial role in diminishing our carbon footprint. And in that sense, Russia can be one of the world leaders, not just in terms of supplying these technologies, but also in supplying hydrogen. We've got many companies working on that. They work in energy and other industries. And we've got many research institutions working on that as well, but we can talk about that separately. So we believe Russia has jumped straight into the world trend of energy transition. But there's one thing I would like to point out. This process should not be discriminatory against the traditional sources of energy, because we believe these traditional sources of energy can also be clean. And our Russian companies are working precisely to achieve that. And I think that's about the end of my remarks, and I can answer your questions. Otherwise, I'm going to take up all of your time as part of this conference. So as moderator, Mr. Novak, I would like to clarify what you've just said as far as hydrogen is concerned. Do you think, what kind of hydrogen is Russia going to follow, either blue hydrogen or green hydrogen? So is it going to be using natural gas or coal to produce hydrogen? Or maybe it's going to follow the European path that is trying to use electrolysis, and this electricity comes from renewables.
Thank you very much, Sergey. Well, talking about the technologies per se, right now, we're working on producing green hydrogen and blue hydrogen, and yellow as well. Well, the gray version is the easiest in terms of technologies used. It is produced out of natural gas through methane conversion. What is important is since, as I've mentioned, our energy mix is quite diversified, we have all the options on the table. Well, first of all, what is important to mention here is that to ensure that these technologies are designed and implemented and introduced into the wholesale operation, Gazprom and Rosatom, Novatek and Rostechnology and many other companies from Russia, including Rosnano, have these technologies or working on these technologies. I'm not going to enumerate many others. I've just focused on the most popular ones. Although when we were studying the situation here, I can say that we have dozens of companies in Russia focusing on that. So I believe that here we could take all the options instead of limiting ourselves to just one specific option. And here we're working on production, on transportation, which is very important, as well as recycling and utilization. When pure hydrogen is produced, one shouldn't forget about CO2 and the way it is going to be stored. If we're talking about CO2 being released into the atmosphere, then that would cross out the efficiency and any point of using hydrogen. Thank you very much for this clarification. So talking about carbon storage, going to be shy, and I'm proud to say that in our report, programmatic ideas, in the first chapter, at the end of the chapter, the following thought is being introduced, which is quite rarely being discussed in Russia. We all have to attach utmost importance of providing electricity to around 2 billion people with low income without any access to electricity in order to satisfy their need in electricity. We need to use conventional resources to be replaced by cleaner energy in the future. So talking about this poor 2 billion people having no access to electricity, we shouldn't forget about the political aspect. And here my question is, do we believe that OPEC Plus will be able to pursue a coordinated policy on oil with the Americans? Yes, indeed, the USA is not part of this process, but at one point they agreed to cut down on their production in harmony with many others. So we'll be able to preserve OPEC Plus mechanisms as a mechanism to preserve the balance of the market and to coordinate with other key stake players. Well, speaking about coordination among countries, it is a voluntary process. And this voluntary process within the framework of the OPEC Plus is underway for 4 years already. Of course, at some point it will come to an end. And as soon as balance is achieved at the market, we will be able just to exchange information as it is stipulated by the charter endorsed by all of us last year. But one should understand that the US administration right now is making statements which run counter to the policy that has been pursued by us for the last 4 years. And from what we hear from the international community, climate agenda is going to be dominating the international agenda, which might have an impact on the United States. So we need to study closely the decisions to be made by the future US administration. But talking about the opportunities for cooperation among countries in order to minimize negative factors that have a negative impact on the market. Well, if there are minor fluctuations, that's okay. But when we talk about such profound changes that we've been witnessing this year, naturally, greater coordination among all the countries will benefit everyone. We do hope that the changes in the policy of the US administration will not have a negative impact on the coordinating efforts of OPEC Plus players that have become very instrumental in maintaining the balance at the market and globally for the global economic recovery. So indeed, oil, as a matter of fact, is among key energy sources. No matter what we want to achieve or no matter what we dream about, we have to deal with it. We have to take it as a matter of fact, and we need to think how to invest efficiently into the sector of oil, in order to ensure energy security and uninterrupted energy supplies. So for the nearest future, this source is going to be used. Well, for those who's going to watch our broadcast on Monday, well, oil Brent futures are minus 4.5%, WTI minus 3.4%, which is quite substantial. So now the floor is open for questions. Radio Romano from Interfax. Dear colleagues, good day. Mr. Novak, going back to the topic, which is the major theme of our today's event, energy transition. Well, so far we can state for sure just one thing. We cannot predict the rate at which this energy transition is going to be implemented. So what do you think are the risks, and which of these risks are greater? The delayed rate of this transition, since we're talking about very costly projects requiring huge and trillions of investments into infrastructure, or there are greater risks of rapid transition, rapid transformation, leading to the fact that in 10, 15 years, the energy landscape is going to be transformed completely. And in that case, we should probably try to ensure the accelerated monetization of the existing projects in this field. I think because in the nearest future, they might become really irrelevant. Well, thank you very much for this question. Very difficult one, actually, because when we talk about energy transition, and going carbon neutral by 2050, we'll heard that China is planning to become neutral in 2060. Other countries are putting forth ambitious goals of becoming carbon neutral in 2040. And these are the countries that are developed. However, our planet is not just developed countries. There are over 7 billion people in the world, and 1/4 of electricity is produced from coal and wood in the global energy mix. Well, of course, wood is not being used, timber is not being used by developed countries. It is being used mostly by developing countries, deprived of other energy sources, more qualitative energy sources and environmentally clean. Well, at the scale of the planet as a whole, it is for sure that we won't be able to become carbon neutral in 2040. Well, hopefully countries that have put forth such an agenda, developed countries, would be able to become carbon neutral by 2040, but not the whole world for sure. And when we see such outlooks, we cannot really understand who is going to pay for that. What consumers, which consumers, and which economy is going to be able to sustain that? Well, in terms of gross national product of any country, these are additional costs to be sustained by any country. And these are enormous costs, enormous investments, and we need to study clearly how these investments are going to be made. And another obvious thing that you've mentioned, in the world, climate agenda is dominating the international landscape, and of course, it's going to be the trend in the future. And it is also important to note that there are much more cheaper energy sources in the world today, including oil, gas, and coal, if we are to talk about hydrocarbons. That has to do with the advancement in new technologies. Before that, these reserves were believed to be not profitable, but taking into account new technologies, new fields are being developed and they become profitable from the point of view of investments. And so the question that is on the agenda right now, take into account these enormous resources that we are able to tap today due to new technologies, over what period of time they're going to be used or going to be called for in next 10, 20 years. In that case, we will have to think about the accelerated monetization, or it will take much longer to use these resources, which means that we were able to prolong the development of such fields, such hard to recover fields, and prolong this development of existing energy sources. It is a very difficult situation. What we need to do right now is to monitor the situation and try to take decisions which would try to bring to terms these two approaches. Well, I believe that in the nearest decades, what we need to think about is the monetization of existing reserves. Thank you very much, Mr. Novak. Well, very interesting messages I've heard from your answers right now, which could be clarified further by our participant from South Korea, Mr. Chung. Let me stress that he's been working on that agenda in the UN, and he's the chairman of the International Committee of Global Energy Price. Ambassador Chung, I'm addressing you in Russian because there is simultaneous interpretation being provided. Well, from Mr. Novak, we've heard about the ideas of how to capture carbon, how to transition to carbon neutral economy, which resonates with our report and which is based on what you at the beginning of the century started to work on within the framework of the UN. So what do you think about all of that?
Yeah, first of all, good evening from Seoul. And it is my great pleasure joining the Deputy Prime Minister Novak for this excellent presentation on Russian position on energy. And I'm very glad that Deputy Prime Minister already mentioned about carbon capture and storage and hydrogen production. And I always believe that Russia still continue to have a very important role to play, even after the energy transition in the years to come. Even for carbon neutrality, oil and gas still has a very important role to play for the transition, because nobody can jump over from the fossil fuel based civilization towards renewable energy overnight. There has to be a transition, and this transition has to be rely on the carbon capture and storage technology. This technology, which is actually featured in the annual report of Global Energy Prize, the annual report, which Sergei just mentioned. This is an excellent annual report, which I really enjoyed reading it. This is 10 breakthrough ideas for next 10 years for energy. And I congratulate the excellent publication of the annual report from Global Energy Prize. And the number one idea that was highlighted in this annual report of Global Energy Prize was carbon capture and storage. And I strongly believe there are already many technologies available, and already demonstration projects are going on in Europe and the United States. And so I think it is very important for Russia to think about how to restructure and reshaping its energy leadership in the context of carbon neutrality in the years to come. And the most important technology and critical technology for that will be carbon capture and storage. And for that, I think it has to be linked with hydrogen production. And we already know that my former chairman of the Global Energy Prize International Award Committee, Dr. Rodney Allam, he invented his own Allam cycle for the carbon capture and the hydrogen production at the same time. I think this is an excellent technology that we should take advantage of it. And I think we should go ahead, Russian government, as well as the private companies, energy companies in Russia, as well as some of the investors from outside. In the case of Korea, we already also committed the Korean government for carbon neutrality by 2050. So now we have already announced our hydrogen roadmap for 2050. And we have a very ambitious plan to enhance our production of hydrogen and also use of hydrogen. So the hydrogen will play a very critical role in the future transition of energy in Korea. So which means there's a huge potential for selling and the marketing hydrogen produced in Russia to other countries like Korea and Japan, and even United States and in Europe. So now Russia can export not only just the fossil fuel, but they can export the hydrogen as a new commodity, energy commodity, which will continue to support the Russian energy leadership. So I strongly support the energy Deputy Prime Minister's idea about carbon capture and storage and hydrogen. And what is important is that not just an idea, we have to move over to actual projects. So if anybody is interested, I will be happy to also introduce Korean investors, Korean companies that is capable of and interested in working together with the Russian energy companies and the Russian government. I will stop here.
Well, I was listening to Ambassador Chung was trying to correlate it with what Mr. Novak has just stated. And now I'd like to turn to Madam Telagina with a very tricky question. A lot from what has been planned in terms of energy transition in Europe is looking more and more realistic due to the fact that everything is underpinned by huge subsidies coming from the European Commission and big companies. Is it realistic to talk about energy transition, a transition to renewable energy, in the whole world, taking into the fact that the ton of hydrogen produced through electrolysis in renewable energy sources is becoming 3 or 4 times more expensive? How realistic will it be for the rest of the world? Well, thank you very much. Good day, dear colleagues. I would like to use this opportunity to give you a presentation. I believe it is very important. I mean, the visual picture is always helpful in order to introduce my ideas. Well, energy transition is not the first process the humanity has been going through. Until the middle of the last century, the whole world was using coal, and although coal is still a major component in the global energy mix, still in the 70s, there was a revolution when oil and natural gas became a dominating factor in global economy. And that was the first energy transition we went through. And it took 70 years actually to ensure this transition from coal to oil and gas, and to them being a dominating factor in the global energy sector. And today, the whole international community is concerned about oil and gas dominating the global energy mix. There are lots of studies on that account, studies about the CO2 released in the atmosphere due to the use of oil and natural gas. Well, talking about whether oil and natural gas are going to be used in 2040 or 2050, a lot depends on the political will of governments and countries, but there are certain factors that speed up this energy transition. And I like this picture by Tony Seba that demonstrates that over 10 years, the Fifth Avenue has changed dramatically with internal combustion engines replacing horses. And here we are talking about the convenience of consumers and preferences of consumers, which are playing a dominating role. I believe that it is very important to take into account when we are trying to define the catalysts which are impacting this process. Well, pandemic is also a catalyst in this field. After pandemic, internal combustion engines are still being used, but now the world is focusing more on new technologies, what is important today is the fact that this energy transition and pandemic have coincided with the rapid growth of digitization, and the pandemic has speeded up the use of artificial intellect and computer technologies. New momentum has been given to digitization as a result of the pandemic. While turning to renewable energy sources, I could say that solar energy is getting cheaper and cheaper. And the cost of solar energy in Norway is the same as the generation of solar energy in California, for example. Whether it's going to be the trend to 2030 or 2040, I don't know, but so far it is the dominating trend today. We are aware of the PP report published in spring this year with various scenarios of oil demand and supply and oil quotations. And what we see today is that oil is within the corridor that seems to be quite comfortable, although it could have been better, of course. And the second factor is the realization by oil companies and natural gas companies of the need that we need to move towards new technologies and new energy sources. And here, the issue of investors is coming to the forefront. Even if the oil price gets higher, shares of oil companies are not going to be that popular anymore. And we see the demand is pivoting towards greener energy. And the interest of investors towards greener energy is growing, supported by the market trends. And of course, there are going to be more investment in the field, naturally followed by some bubbles and some black swans. But this trend has impacted the quotations of companies, in forcing them to review their business models. One more important factor to take into account is the Chinese development. As you see, China is the greatest producer of energy in the world, 2 times higher, 2 times more energy is produced, electricity is produced in China than in the United States. Over the last 5 years, China has accumulated huge potential in terms of solar and wind generation, and it is a key player at the market. China is actively developing electric engines. So in 10, 20 years, I believe that China is going to dominate the market in terms of renewable energy sources. Naturally, it is a big country that uses all energy sources, but the share of renewable energy sources is growing in China. 4 biggest countries, India, United States, China, and the European Union, have put forth quite ambitious goals of transition to renewable energy sources with various time frames. But what we need to take into account here is what's going on right now. As a result of digitization, as a result of the greater use of AI, there is a transition from vertically integrated company to horizontal, small productions. That is the transition from a rigid model of production into a more flexible model of production. And this market transformation is very conducive to this trend, which is quite obvious for the Chinese economy, where services are taking up a very modest share in the global GDP compared to many other countries. So the model of the market is being transformed as a result of all of this. The behavior of consumers today tends to opt for more distributed relations in energy. Consumers not only prefer green energy as environmentally clean energy, but this distributed generation helps younger generation to become a member of this energy community and to participate not only in purchasing electricity, but also participating in its generation. This super grids is yet another trend which younger generations opt for. And take into account this 3D of the energy markets: decarbonization, decentralization, digitization. We can say that from a commodity, energy is turning into a service, which is an absolutely different business model. Yet another very important factor is the fact that these new trends are being developed side by side with the advancement of Z generation, which is a digital generation, which lives online, which wants to be sufficient, self-sufficient, which are not that concerned about well-being. Well, I beg my pardon, but I heard that Mr. Novak has to take an urgent call. Let's say goodbye to him. We have to let him go, and we will get back to you. Mr. Novak, thank you very much. Hope to see you soon. Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure for me to answer your questions. And I'll start a summary of all the presentations which are going to be delivered later on. Thank you very much. Well, Yelena, please go on. Well, I'm coming to a conclusion actually, but what I wanted to say is this new generation Z, is focused on the life online, and it is entering this life with new set of consumer demand patterns, and that is the generation which can be mostly found in Asia, and this generation is going to have an impact on the international community. This generation is living a better life than the older generation, and this Asian generation of a new kind will dominate the energy generation in the future. And that's how I see energy landscape of the future. Energy transition is going to be stimulated by consumer demand. These new technologies being introduced on a day-to-day basis show that they're becoming more and more convenient. For example, in Moscow, there is a transition towards e-buses. And this trend will continue. Elena, I'm sorry you turned off your mic. Please turn on your mic to continue. So a very important argument in favor for this accelerated energy transition is this succinct space. Thank you. Let me check one of your thoughts. And let me get back to Ambassador Chung. Yes, indeed, greater accessibility of these technologies is one aspect in terms of price, I mean, greater affordability. There is an idealistic approach also can be found among younger generations, which always stick to something new. I know that Ambassador Chung has a small solar panel at home, which is sufficient for him to power his computer. But nevertheless, could you answer this question? Well, young Koreans, do they surprise you with new approaches to this energy topic? Is there something else that is driving them? Not money, but these aspiration for a better future, for example. Mr. Chung, are you online? Mr. Chung, have you heard the question? Okay, Mr. Chung will be able.
Yeah, I just heard Sergey the question, but I heard the original Russian language as well, so I cannot clearly hear the English translation. So it's a bit difficult to catch what Sergey's question was. Can you interpret me in English only?
Было сложно понять основной посыл вашего вопроса. Не могли бы, пожалуйста, еще раз только на английском мне повторить этот вопрос?
Yeah, to make things easier, actually switch into the English channel.
Да, будет проще, если я сам задам вам вопрос на английском языке.
We're talking about the rationale behind some of the decisions, especially among the youngsters, as far as energy is concerned.
Том, чем руководствуются молодые поколения,
This
когда
is
говорят о
viable and
энергопереходе?
conceivable because the prices go down and the say what
С одной стороны, да,
the economy of the solar economy has become the same, equal in South
цен,
Korea
я имею в
and
виду, что
Norway.
солнечная энергетика, как мы слышали,
Are there
становится все более
situations when you
дешевой.
talk to youngsters in your country, not because of the money, but because of their ideals?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, it's not only youngsters in Korea, but I think many youngsters around the world. They have been already, you know, that Greta Thunberg and they are fighting for climate change all over the world. And so even in Korea, you know, there's a strong movement supporting the very strong climate action. So I think it's going to be a kind of new trend for the future generations to be very conscious about, because it's their security and it's their survival issue in the future. So these youngsters are very sensitive about it. So it's going to be a new political momentum and dynamism that support a strong trend action for climate change. So it's not just a matter of money, but the strong political agenda and the political support, which will stimulate technological innovations. You mentioned about the cost of carbon capture and storage, but we hear a lot of innovations that can bring down the cost. So there are already technologies that can bring down the cost of carbon capture and storage to a very affordable level. And in Korea, even in the United States, there's already projects are going on because the cost has been reduced dramatically over the a few years. So it's going to be an issue of who is going to be the pioneer of new technology and creating a new market. We cannot just rely on conventional energy market, but there are some companies, some technologies, and some people are trying to create new market and new even technology for carbon capture and storage and also hydrogen. So this kind of new movement will be pushed very hard, strongly, by the aspiration of the younger generations in Korea as well as all over the world.
Very well. Let's then ask Alexei Gromov. Let's ask how realistic he thinks the possibility is of emerging of a new sector of economy, a new market based on these aspirations that Mr. Chung has been talking about. Thank you very much, Sergey, for giving me the floor. I'm probably the youngest speaker today, and it is very interesting to know indeed what the young people, young generation think about their place in this energy transition. So in response to your question and joining what the previous speakers have said, I would like to say the following. Indeed, on the one hand, energy transition is happening, and a lot of questions arise about the pace of this transition, about the dynamics of how we're moving towards this transition. But it is of principal importance to know how the so-called uncertainty factors are going to play out, the factors that determine the pace and the rate of this energy transition. They can be the so-called black swan, as it were. They can introduce an element of uncertainty. Let me show you one slide. I do hope that you are able to see it. My speech is going to be very short because we're running out of time. I would like to point out that I believe there are three principal uncertainties. Even though I'm part of Generation Z, I'm 40, but I'm not a millennial, but I think that these uncertainties relate to three pillars: the conduct of three important groups that have an impact on this transition: consumers, namely regulators and investors. And Mr. Novak and Elena and Professor Chung have all been speaking about that. But at the end of our today's discussion, I would like to draw your attention to the following fact. Let's look at the consumers. We see a whole new generation of people who are brought up with an absolutely new paradigm of how climate has to be protected, how environment has to be protected. We see new ethics. People refuse on ethical grounds from using hydrocarbons and products based on them. And we see the change in food habits. People are trying to buy environmentally friendly crops, and the same happens in the energy field. And as we can see, the energy consumption model across the world is changing too, and there are factors of new mobility, as it were. Today, we have not touched much on electric cars or the new mobility, but I think it is also important within the context of energy transition. When I read lectures at Sciences Po in Paris, I always ask the same question, addressing it to my 20-year or so students. I'm asking them what kind of material success they envisage for themselves. Russian students believe, 80% of them, they think that personal car is a factor of success, whereas in Europe, it's completely different. Over the last 3 years, I have not met a single student that thinks that a car is important for success, which testifies to the fact that the paradigm of values is shifting and how we view resources. People say that cars are too expensive. It is easy to use an e-car or take a taxi or maybe some public transport. On the other hand, Mr. Novak has mentioned that too. Energy transition requires titanic investment, and this money has to come from somewhere. Someone will have to pay for the energy transition, and the burden is primarily going to be on the consumer. The question is how willing the consumer today is willing to forego his convenience in favor of introducing new models. And this is indeed a very good question. I think in 2019, Mr. Brilov covered the yellow jackets movement quite widely. Where did it spring for? There was a new tax introduced, a new tax on fuel at gas stations, and this tax was meant to fuel the development of green energy, and the people spoke against this tax. So the question is whether the population today is willing to forego their comfort for the sake of cleaner development, more eco-friendly development. It's absolutely obvious that without sacrifices from the mass consumers, nothing is going to come out of it. There is another issue. The decarbonization policy in Korea, in China, in Europe, and elsewhere, this policy is going to be a determining factor for energy companies that are elaborating a long-term strategy. Let's take the ban on the sales of internal combustion engine cars in Europe and in Switzerland. Such a ban is going to be introduced after 2025, and in other countries maybe even after 2030. And this is also a factor that is going to have an impact upon the future of oil processing across the EU and across all of that. And another important factor, that's the conduct of investors. Alexander has pointed out that the interest of investors is tilted towards green energy, even though the margin there is around 2 to 3%, the return on investment. It's very rarely more than 5%, whereas in oil investment, the margin is higher, and yet investors are flocking into clean energy. Why is this happening? Amid the energy transition, investors see fewer and fewer prospects for oil and gas in the coming 10 to 15 years. And it turns out that for most oil projects, you get finally your return within this period. 10 to 15 years. And investors right now would like to get their return as soon as possible. And that is why they're investing in new industries that are enjoying the support of regulators, the interest of regulators, and also that enjoy the support of consumers. So this nexus of investors and consumers is going to determine the pace of energy transition, is going to show us the opportunities for building new markets that Professor Chung has said, speaking about new technologies, hydrogen and carbon storage and capture. In conclusion, I would like to say that the COVID-19 pandemic has not just accelerated the energy transition. I think that would be oversimplifying the impact of the pandemic upon energy. I think it exacerbated the differences, the controversies between the developing countries and the advanced economies. In what way? You see, we have seen an artificial contraction of demand because there were lower prices and lower demand, and it had an impact on key energy sources in the market. And the developing countries have not had the same cushion of security. They have had no buffer that would have allowed them to continue successfully with renewables. And that is why they had this temptation of getting back to oil and gas and hydrocarbons to address the issue of their energy poverty. That is why the developing countries are seeing an increase in demand on energy. But there is an adverse trend in developed countries that are trying to emerge from the crisis with an emphasis on low carbon development. Let me cite an example of the EU. It's to the tune of 850 million euro, and mostly it prioritizes low carbon energy projects. We are living in interesting times, and I think that there are going to be many more occasions that will give us a chance among experts to talk about the energy transition and the realities we're living in. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. I think we have had a very good overview of both industries, and we have had many experts tuning in. If colleagues have more questions, go ahead, or if not, then I think it has been a wonderful brainstorm of 70 minutes or so. I still leave the floor open for questions. Does anyone have questions? No, I think we're not going to offend anyone if we wrap up. I think it's going to be fine. So friends, once again, I should like to thank everyone who has taken part in this session today. I would like to thank Interfax and the Institute for International Economic Relations for organizing a series of these wonderful meetings. It is always a pleasure to participate. I would also like to thank Mr. Novak again, who's left us already. Professor Chung, thank you. Madam Telegina, Alexei Gromov, thank you. And I look forward to seeing you again. I think everyone has had their say.